The bull refused to leave the riverbank, an unstoppable force blocking the way, until a farmer's son found a body beneath the surface. What happens next will leave you speechless. The rope went taut in Caleb's hands, biting into his palms as Brutus refused to take another step. The bull stood knee-deep in the river, muscles rigid beneath his thick hide, nostrils flaring with sharp snorts. His hooves churned the current, splashing mud and water into the fading light of evening. Caleb yanked again, irritation creeping into his voice. "Come on, Brutus, don't start this now." The animal did not budge. Instead, he lowered his massive head, eyes fixed on something beneath the surface, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Caleb followed the line of his stare and frowned. The water there seemed darker, shadows swirling unnaturally in the current. For a moment he thought it was nothing more than a log caught in the shallows, but then he saw it, pale, unmoving, and wrong. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. A hand. He stumbled back, the rope slipping through his fingers until it snapped tight again. Brutus did not follow. The bull stood his ground like a sentinel, blocking the river as though daring the current to reveal its secret. Caleb's chest tightened. His first instinct was to run, but his legs felt rooted. The hand lay wedged between two stones, fingers splayed stiffly as the water curled around them. "Elias!" Caleb shouted, voice breaking in panic. His call carried across the field where his older brother worked near the fence line. Elias straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, before jogging toward the river with a puzzled expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone sharp as he approached. Caleb pointed wordlessly, his arm trembling. Elias crouched by the bank, peering into the water, and his face drained of color. "Stay back," Elias muttered, though his own hands shook as he unlaced his boots and waded in. The water rose quickly to his thighs, the current tugging at his balance, but he pushed forward until he reached the stones. Caleb could see his brother's arms straining as he wrestled with the heavy form stuck beneath. When the body finally broke free, it surfaced with a sickening slowness, waterlogged and limp, hair drifting like dark weeds in the current. Elias dragged it toward the bank, his jaw tight. Caleb rushed forward despite his fear, grabbing the man's arm to help pull him onto the grass. The sight that met him made his stomach lurch. It was Jonah. The drifter had been a familiar figure months ago, wandering into Ironvale with little more than a worn satchel and a restless look in his eyes. He had worked odd jobs for their father, hauling wood, mending fences, sleeping in the barn when nights grew cold. Caleb remembered the man's quiet voice, the way he always kept to himself, and the peculiar intensity in his gaze when someone mentioned Rowan, the powerful land baron who owned most of the valley. Then, one day, Jonah had vanished without a word. No goodbyes, no explanation. Just gone. Now here he was, sprawled lifeless on the riverbank. His shirt was torn, soaked through, and his skin carried dark bruises. Around his neck, above the collarbone, was a raw groove that could only have come from a rope. Caleb stared at it, unable to speak, his mind racing in disbelief. Elias knelt beside the body, pressing 2 fingers against Jonah's throat, though he already knew the answer. "He's gone," he said quietly, voice heavy. Caleb's hands curled into fists at his sides. This wasn't an accident." Elias looked at him sharply. "You don't know that." "I do," Caleb insisted, his voice trembling but firm. He gestured at the bruises, the rope mark, the torn clothing. "You see it too. Someone did this to him." Elias hesitated, glancing back toward the fading light where the field stretched into shadows. "Maybe he got tangled in something. Maybe the river—" "No," Caleb cut in. His chest heaved as memory surfaced like a knife through water. Weeks ago, he had passed by Rowan's office at the edge of town and heard raised voices through the open window. Jonah's tone had been desperate, angry, while Rowan's had been cold and sharp. Caleb hadn't lingered long, but one line burned in his mind. Jonah shouting about proof that would ruin Rowan. The rope mark on Jonah's throat felt like the ending of that argument. Elias sat back, shaking his head as if refusing to follow Caleb's thoughts. "We need to tell Father," he said at last. Caleb nodded faintly, but his eyes remained fixed on Jonah's lifeless form. The man had been nothing more than a drifter, with no family in town, no one to speak for him. If they left this to others, would anyone care how he died? Or would his body be buried quietly, his story dismissed like the countless whispers that already circled Rowan's name? Brutus stamped the ground behind them, his heavy breath loud in the silence. Caleb turned to look at the bull, and for a moment it seemed the animal's dark eyes held a strange weight, as if he had understood what lay beneath the river long before they did. Caleb's skin prickled. "Brutus knew," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the hum of crickets. Elias gave him a questioning glance, but Caleb pressed on, his heart beating harder with each word. He wouldn't move. He was guarding him, waiting for us to see. Elias exhaled sharply, scrubbing a hand over his face. You're imagining things. But Caleb wasn't so sure. The bull had stopped exactly over Jonah's body, pawing and snorting until Caleb had been forced to look. It was as though Brutus had been protecting the river's secret until it could no longer be ignored. They covered Jonah with Elias's jacket before carrying him toward the barn, their steps uneven beneath the weight. Caleb's arms ached, but his mind raced faster than his body could keep up. He remembered Jonah's guarded glances, his habit of writing in a small notebook whenever he thought no one was watching. What had he written in there? What had he meant by proof? When they laid Jonah on the barn floor, the silence became unbearable. Caleb stared down at the man's hollowed face, lips parted as if to speak a final word that never came. What do we do now? Caleb asked softly. Elias's jaw tightened. We tell Father, and then the sheriff. It's the only way. Caleb wanted to believe that would be enough, but the memory of Rowan's cold voice during that argument twisted in his chest. Jonah had threatened to ruin him, and now Jonah was dead. If Rowan truly was behind this, would the sheriff even dare to act? Caleb wasn't sure. That night, lying awake in the narrow loft above the barn, Caleb could not close his eyes without seeing Jonah's lifeless stare. The image clung to him, heavy as the rope mark etched into the man's neck. Outside, Brutus shifted restlessly in his stall, letting out low huffs that seemed more like warnings than sighs. Caleb turned onto his side, staring into the darkness, his thoughts pulling him back to that single memory of Jonah's voice, sharp and defiant against Rowan's silence. Proof, Jonah had said. Proof that'll ruin you. And now Jonah lay dead in the river. Caleb pressed his fists against his chest, his breathing shallow as the truth settled deeper. This was no accident. It was a silencing. Sheriff Dalton arrived the next morning, his boots crunching against the gravel yard as though every step was a statement. His wide-brimmed hat shadowed a face carved with years of authority, the kind of face that left little room for argument. Caleb stood near the barn, arms crossed tightly across his chest, while Elias leaned against the fence post beside him. The air was cool but heavy, the silence broken only by the restless snorts of Brutus in the stall. Dalton glanced at Jonah's body, now covered with a sheet Elias had laid across him. He did not kneel to examine, nor did he ask many questions. Instead, he simply tugged the brim of his hat lower and muttered, "River claims its own." Caleb's fists clenched at his sides. "That's all you're going to say?" His voice cracked with disbelief, and Elias shot him a warning look. Dalton's eyes shifted to Caleb, cold and sharp. "Son, you'd be wise not to stir what doesn't need stirring." He was a drifter. No family, no home. The current can be cruel. He turned and waved a hand toward the men he'd brought with him. "Cart him away. Best the town forgets." Caleb felt something twist in his stomach. Forget? Jonah was a man, not just debris the river had tossed ashore. He looked to Elias, who gave him a steady but weary gaze. That glance said it all. They both knew this was no ordinary death, but Dalton had no intention of admitting it. The sheriff's haste was too practiced, his tone too final, as if he were carrying out orders already given. By noon, Jonah's body was gone, and so too was Dalton. But his words lingered, a bitter taste that Caleb couldn't wash away. Later that day, the sound of hooves on packed dirt announced another visitor. Rowan. The land baron rode in with his usual air of wealth, clean boots, polished coat, and a smile that was more weapon than greeting. He dismounted slowly, taking in the farmyard as though it already belonged to him. Caleb felt the muscles in his neck tighten. "Terrible news, isn't it?" Rowan said, his tone laced with false sympathy. "A shame about Jonah, a restless man with restless ways." He clasped Elias on the shoulder with too much familiarity before letting his gaze settle on Caleb. The look was long, assessing, sharp enough to cut. "We're managing," Elias replied evenly. His voice carried the steady calm he often used when he wanted to avoid conflict. Rowan's lips curved in a faint smile. "Of course you are. You always manage. But farms are hard work, harder now, with uncertainty all around. I can ease that burden. My offer still stands, for the land. I'll even raise it. Generosity in times like these is rare, wouldn't you agree?" Caleb stiffened. Rowan's words seemed rehearsed, too smooth for the moment. And yet his eyes never left Caleb, watching him with a subtle pressure that made his skin crawl. It was as if Rowan knew what he had seen, what he was thinking, and was reminding him to keep silent. Elias shifted, crossing his arms. "We're not selling." Rowan sighed, the sound soft but deliberate. "Stubbornness runs in your family. Think on it, Elias. Think carefully." He turned, mounted his horse, and with one last look at Caleb, rode off down the lane. That night, Brutus bellowed from the barn with a fury that rattled the rafters. Caleb shot out of bed, heart hammering, and rushed down with Elias at his heels. The bull paced in his stall, slamming his hooves into the ground, eyes wild as though he could still smell Jonah on the air. Caleb reached for him, trying to soothe, but Brutus's great head swung toward the door, snorting into the night. Elias frowned, his face pale in the lantern light. He knows something's wrong. Caleb swallowed hard. Jonah's lifeless eyes haunted him in the darkness, refusing to fade. Finally, he turned to his brother. I think Jonah had proof against Rowan, something he didn't want anyone to see. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, weary. Proof or no proof, he's gone. We can't just throw accusations without something solid. Dalton won't listen. You saw that yourself. Then we find it, Caleb said firmly. His voice was steadier than he felt, but the conviction in his chest pushed him forward. Elias studied him for a long moment before sighing. You're not going to let this go, are you? Caleb shook his head. Not until we know. The next evening, under a fading sun, they returned to the river. The water murmured softly, carrying secrets downstream. Brutus came with them, tugging against his lead until they stopped at the same spot where Jonah had been found. Caleb knelt and pressed his hands into the stones, searching with fingers that trembled. Elias waded in, scanning the water with cautious eyes. Look here, Caleb whispered suddenly. Beneath a loose pile of river rock, his hand brushed against glass. He pulled free a bottle, its cork swollen but still intact. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, waterlogged but legible in places. They broke the seal carefully, spreading the page against a flat stone. The numbers sprawled across it made no sense to Caleb, but Elias leaned closer, his brow furrowing. These are records. Livestock counts, land transactions, and not clean ones. He tapped a line with his finger, his expression darkening. Rowan's been stealing stock, selling land he doesn't even own. Jonah must have been keeping track. Caleb's heart raced. This is what he meant. The proof before Elias could reply, a sudden glow cut through the trees, the steady swaying light of a lantern. Caleb froze, blood pounding in his ears. A shadow moved closer, the shape of a broad-shouldered man stepping from the woods. Sheriff Dalton. The lantern's light caught his face, the grim set of his mouth, the eyes that lingered on the paper in Elias's hand. He stopped a few paces away, the night insects humming around them, and his voice came low and edged. You boys are digging where you don't belong. The words were delivered like a warning, but the tone carried something heavier, a threat. Dalton let the silence hang, broken only by the river's steady current. Caleb's heart pounded, his throat dry. He knew in that moment that Jonah's death had not been meant for discovery, and by finding this, they had already stepped too far. Elias folded the paper swiftly, slipping it into his coat. We were just... Don't, Dalton cut in, his voice firm. He raised the lantern higher, the flame casting long shadows across his face. Some things are better left buried. Caleb's pulse thundered in his ears. The sheriff's words were not advice. They were a cage. He looked at Elias, who gave him the smallest nod, a silent plea for restraint. But Caleb's mind spun. Rowan's gaze, Dalton's quick dismissal, Jonah's warning. It all fit together, and it all pointed toward danger greater than either of them had imagined. As Dalton stood watching them, silent but immovable, Caleb felt a chill ripple through him. This was no longer about curiosity or justice, it was about survival. And in that moment, he realized they weren't just uncovering a secret, they were walking straight into a trap. Here's part 3 expanded into a full cinematic chapter, written exactly as requested, with depth, suspense, and a seamless build-up to the climactic ambush. Over the next days, the farm grew tense. Brutus refused to calm, his massive frame pacing the fence line with a restless energy that unsettled even Elias. Each time Rowan's riders passed along the distant road, the bull stamped and bellowed as though he alone could smell the danger in the wind. Caleb watched him often, torn between admiration and unease. It was as if Brutus knew the storm was closing in before the men themselves could see it. Inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere was no lighter. Elias urged restraint at every turn, warning Caleb that pressing further would bring the same fate Jonah had met. But Caleb's conviction had hardened into something immovable. He could not look at the fragment of Jonah's ledger without hearing the drowned man's silence screaming back at him. If he died trying to expose Rowan, then leaving this buried makes us no better, Caleb told his brother one evening. His voice carried a sharp edge, though his hands trembled as he clutched the damp paper. Elias answered with weary eyes and a heavy sigh, but he did not argue further. From that night onward, Caleb moved with quiet purpose. When Elias tended the fields, he slipped into Ironvale, hiding the ledger scrap beneath his shirt. He haunted the dim back rooms of the feed store, rifling through records when the clerk wasn't watching. He lingered at the mill, pretending to trade while his eyes searched the dusty ledgers stacked against the walls. Each number he compared, each name he traced, sharpened the picture. Forged deeds, illegal sales. Cattle counted twice, then vanishing without record. Caleb's heart hammered each time the evidence aligned with Jonah's notes, painting Rowan as the architect of theft on a scale larger than anyone had imagined. But with each visit came risk. The first time Caleb felt eyes on him, it was only a flicker, a figure lingering too long in the shadow of the general store as dusk fell. The second time, the figure followed, steps measured and patient as Caleb made the long walk home along the ridge road. By the time he reached the farm gate, sweat slicked his palms despite the cool night air. He told Elias nothing, but his resolve deepened. The message came the following night. A stone hurled through his window with a sharp crash, glass raining onto the floor. Caleb leapt from his bed, heart pounding, and found the rock wrapped in paper. In thick black letters it read, "Leave it buried." His hands shook as he held it. Elias rushed into the room, lantern in hand, and when he read the note, his jaw tightened. "This has gone too far," Elias whispered. "We can't fight men like Rowan and Dalton. We'll pack what we can and go before—" "No!" Caleb snapped, more forceful than he intended. His eyes burned with something fierce. "We're closer than ever. This is proof they're afraid. And if they're afraid, it means we can finish what Jonah started." Elias turned away, running a hand through his hair, torn between duty to his brother and dread of what lay ahead. The days that followed pressed heavier, the air itself thick with threat. Then came the turning point. Brutus, again restless, broke from his pen and stormed toward the river. Caleb and Elias pursued him, calling his name, but the bull charged ahead with unshakable purpose, his massive hooves pounding against the earth until he plunged into the shallows. Caleb stopped short, breathless, watching as Brutus pawed the water, bellowing until foam sprayed the banks. Something glinted beneath the surface. Caleb waded in, the chill of the river biting at his legs, and felt his hands close around a submerged crate, sealed tight with tar. With Elias's help, he heaved it ashore, coughing with effort. They pried the lid open, and inside lay branding irons, each marked with familiar ranch emblems, marks from cattle Rowan had claimed as his own. Beneath the irons, bound in oilcloth, were ledgers thicker than Jonah's fragment. Elias's fingers shook as he opened them. Names, sales, payments made to Dalton, connections to men known for violence, listed in neat, damning ink. "It's all here," Elias whispered, his voice unsteady. "Everything." Caleb's breath came fast, his chest rising and falling with exhilaration and dread. This was no longer suspicion. It was proof so heavy it could crush Rowan's empire. "We have him," Caleb murmured, gripping the edge of the crate as though it might vanish. But the triumph was short-lived. From beyond the trees came the thud of hooves, the murmur of voices, and then the sharp whistle of command. Rowan's men. Lanterns flared through the branches, cutting gold slashes against the dark. Caleb's stomach dropped. "They found us," he hissed. "Take what you can," Elias snapped, shoving a ledger into Caleb's arms. They scrambled, shoving crates aside in frantic haste. Brutus bellowed and swung his massive body toward the approaching riders, his horns gleaming in the half-light. The bull charged, scattering the first men who broke through the brush, buying the brothers precious seconds. Caleb and Elias sprinted into the woods, branches clawing at their faces, lungs burning with every step. Behind them came the shouts of Rowan's men, the crashing of hooves, the crack of rifles being primed. Brutus followed, thundering behind them like a living wall, keeping the men from closing in too quickly. Caleb clutched the ledger to his chest, its weight as heavy as iron, while Elias carried another under his arm. They did not stop until the farm was far behind, their breaths ragged, sweat streaming despite the night air. Only when the woods grew still did Elias finally slow, pressing his back against a tree. His chest heaved as he spoke. "We can't keep this hidden. Rowan controls the town. Dalton, too. If we give this to anyone here, it dies with us." "Then where?" Caleb demanded, his voice raw with desperation. Elias looked up, eyes lit with the fire of resolve. "Westmere, the district court, miles away but beyond Rowan's reach. If we bring this there, they'll have to listen." Caleb's mind raced. The distance was daunting, the danger certain, but the idea glowed like a fragile light in the dark. Westmere could mean safety. It could mean justice. Yet even as hope flickered, fate closed its fist. For Rowan was not a man who let prey slip easily. The following night, as the brothers prepared to leave Ironvale with the ledgers wrapped and hidden, the road seemed too quiet. Brutus trudged beside them, his breath loud in the cool air. Caleb felt the prickle of unease crawl along his neck. Then, as they reached the crossroads where the oak trees bent low over the path, shadows stepped out from the dark, men, armed, faces hard and cruel, and in the center, calm as stone, stood Sheriff Dalton. His lantern glowed, casting a harsh light that revealed Rowan's riders at his back, rifles glinting in the night. Caleb froze, his chest tightening, as Dalton's eyes fixed on the brothers. The sheriff's voice came smooth, almost gentle, but his meaning struck like a knife. The river gave you something that wasn't yours. Tonight it takes it back. The night tore open with a sudden roar. Brutus, the bull that had always stood like a silent sentinel, lunged forward without warning. His massive body surged into the circle of men, horns catching lantern light as his hooves tore into the dirt. The attackers scattered like startled crows, stumbling back in panic. Dalton jerked his pistol up, but the bull's bulk drove him off balance before he could fire. The animal's fury was raw, born of instincts sharper than any blade, and for a moment the world seemed to crack apart beneath the violence. Elias didn't hesitate. He threw himself at the nearest man, his shoulder slamming into ribs with a thud that carried through his own bones. The attacker hit the ground, scrambling for breath as Elias wrestled him down. Across the clearing, Caleb clutched the wooden crate, the one carrying the ledgers and scraps of evidence, and fought against a man trying to wrench it from his hands. His fingers burned as nails split and wood cut into his palms, but he held on. Gunfire shattered the night. Muzzle flashes flared, bright against the wagon wheels, sparks leaping as lead tore into iron. Brutus bellowed, horns swinging wide, forcing two men into the mud. Elias ducked as a bullet screamed overhead, his heart slamming against his ribs. Caleb felt the rush of death whistle past him as a ball tore into the wagon behind him, shattering a wheel. "Run!" Elias roared, his voice breaking against the chaos. Caleb didn't question. He wrenched the crate free, ramming his shoulder into his attacker's chin. The man fell back, clutching his face as blood seeped between his fingers. Caleb stumbled, then sprinted, his legs moving before his mind caught up. Elias was beside him a heartbeat later, his chest heaving, his breath ragged with the effort. Behind them, Rowan's men surged again. Dalton, red-faced and furious, fired blindly into the dark, shouting orders drowned by the roar of the bull. Brutus crashed against a wagon, splintering wood, giving the brothers one last breath of space. The two ran hard, their boots pounding through the churned dirt of the fairground. The night air clawed at their lungs, cold and biting, every breath a knife. Fields stretched out before them, dim under the pale glow of the moon. "They're on us," Caleb panted, his chest burning. He glanced back to see shadows breaking loose from the firelight, men racing after them, rifles glinting. "Keep going," Elias gritted, his voice hoarse. His hand pressed against his side where a bullet had grazed him, blood soaking into his shirt. He forced his legs to keep moving. "We can't stop here!" The fields of Ironvale opened wide, the rows of corn and wheat swaying like ghostly walls. The stalks whipped at their faces as they plunged into the darkness, trying to put distance between themselves and the men hunting them. Every rustle behind them carried the threat of a bullet. Caleb's arms ached from clutching the crate, but he refused to let go. Inside was proof, the ledger pages that showed Rowan's lies, the smuggling routes, the bribes. Without it, Jonah's death would remain only whispers on the river. For hours, it felt like the chase would never end. The men pursued them across the fields, sometimes close enough for Caleb to hear their shouts, sometimes falling behind when the brothers ducked through ditches or stumbled across fences. Brutus's roar faded behind them, but its echo stayed with Caleb, a reminder that the bull had bought them this chance. By the time the horizon began to pale with the first wash of dawn, their bodies were broken with exhaustion. Blood streaked Elias's side, and Caleb's arms trembled under the weight of the crate. Their clothes were torn, their lungs raw. Still, they pressed on, driven by something deeper than fear, by the need to end Rowan's reign before more men like Jonah were swallowed in silence. The courthouse of Westmere rose before them like a fortress against the morning light. Its stone walls caught the dawn, tall windows glowing faintly as if already awake. The brothers stumbled up the steps, their boots leaving streaks of dirt and blood across the marble. The great oak doors groaned as Caleb shoved them open. Inside, the echo of their entrance filled the hall. Judge Herrick, an old man with stern eyes and a frame bent by years of service, looked up from his desk. His gavel rested forgotten as his gaze fell on the two figures dragging crates across his polished floor. "Judge," Elias rasped, his voice breaking. We have proof." Caleb dropped the crate with a heavy thud, the lid cracking open to spill ledger pages, maps, and scraps of correspondence. He fumbled with the smaller pieces he had carried in his pocket, spreading them on the judge's desk with trembling hands. Herrick leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the names and numbers. His hand lingered on the ledgers, tracing the routes, the payments, the signatures. His lips tightened into a thin line. The door slammed open. Rowan stormed in, his face pale beneath the polished arrogance he wore like armor. Dalton followed, his pistol still holstered but his posture tense. "This is nonsense," Rowan barked, his voice booming through the hall. He pointed a shaking finger toward the brothers. "These boys are thieves and liars! Dismiss this madness at once!" Judge Herrick did not look up immediately. He finished reading the last page before him, then raised his gaze. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of stone. "Rowan, the evidence is clear. You will stand trial for fraud, smuggling, and conspiracy. Until then, you are under arrest." The words struck like a hammer blow. Rowan's eyes widened, his mouth opening to protest, but the guards moved before he could draw breath. Shackles clamped onto his wrists, cold iron snapping against skin that had once commanded a town. Dalton backed away, his face twisting as if searching for a way out. Herrick's voice cut him down before he could speak. "And you, Dalton," the judge said, his tone hard as iron. "Your part in these bribes is recorded as well. You will answer for it." The marshal's pistol was stripped from him, his badge removed, leaving him pale and hollow. For Ironvale, the scandal cracked open like thunder. Word raced across the valley, through farms and taverns, through the very fields Rowan once claimed as his own. His empire collapsed overnight, debts spilling into the light, land seized, allies scattering like rats from a sinking ship. But for Caleb, victory was not sweet. Jonah's face still haunted him, pale in the current, eyes clouded by the silence of the river. No judge's gavel could bring back the man who had tried to do the right thing and paid for it. Weeks later, Caleb stood by the riverbank, the same waters that had refused to give Jonah's body back until it was too late. The morning was quiet, the current whispering around smooth stones. Brutus waded through the stream, his great bulk calm now, his head dipping as he crossed. For the first time, the bull didn't pause at the middle, didn't stand guard over the place where secrets had drowned. He moved on, as if the burden he had carried had finally lifted. Caleb watched him go, a heaviness in his chest that words couldn't touch. It felt like a farewell, not just to the animal, but to the drifter whose courage had sparked all of this. The town would remember Rowan's scandal, the trial, the downfall. But Caleb knew what he would remember. He would remember the river, the way it whispered, the way it had refused to let go. He would remember Jonah. In the end, the bull had seen what no man dared to see, and it was a farmer's son who listened. The town would remember the scandal, but Caleb would remember the river, and the body it refused to let go. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of loss, the intuitive nature of animals, and the profound ways that life and death can intersect in unexpected moments. This narrative aims to highlight the hidden signs that surround us, inspire compassion, and remind us that a single act of courage can uncover a heartbreaking truth.